All right, I'm going to get started. Thanks for showing up at our Proposition 68 Groundwater Treatment and Remediation Grant Program, Draft Funding Guidelines webinar.
Down arrow.
So this presentation is going to be recorded, and we're going to post the presentation in about a week. My name is Robert Reeves. I'm the program manager with the Groundwater Unit, Bond Section, Division of Financial Assistance at the State Water Resources Control Board. The purpose of this workshop is to provide an overview of the solicitation and evaluation guidelines for $80 million in funding, which is allocated under the California Drought, Water, Parks, Climate, Coastal, and Outdoor Act of 2018, which is commonly referred to as Proposition 68. So I want to first introduce our staff that are here today. Matt Pavlicek, who will be giving the presentation today. Aparajit Ranji, who's going to be taking questions over the web. And I also want to introduce Megan Tosney in the back right here. She's our bond section chief, and she'll be also here to answer any questions as well. So on this page right here, we have the web link to submit questions electronically if you've joined us. We also have additional information on the link below where we have our guidelines posted for this new program. Again, this presentation is being recorded. And we also have question slides in between our presentation. I'd like you to hold your questions for those question slides if possible. Okay, so here's the agenda today. Just wanted to basically say this is an overview of the guidelines. It's not a complete review of the guidelines, so if you have any detailed questions, you may ask those during the question period. So Matt, you want to come up?
All right, good morning. So like Robert said, just some background here. The California Drought, Water, Parks, Climate, Coastal Protection, and Outdoor Access for All Act of 2018, which is commonly referred to as Proposition 68, Chapter 11.1. It allocates $80 million for grants for treatment and remediation activities that prevent or reduce the contamination of groundwater that serves as a source of drinking water. The grants will be administered through the Division of Financial Assistance Application Submittal Tool, or FAST. A few other notes, the grant funds must be encumbered by June 30th of 2021 and liquidated by June 30th of 2023. And the draft guidelines were released for public review and comment on May 17th of this year. So again, in terms of funding, after accounting for administrative costs, about $74 million is available for grants for projects. We are proposing a $16 million set aside for projects serving severely disadvantaged communities, or SDACs. And a unique aspect to this program is that these grant funds can be utilized for non-capital expenditures, such as ongoing operation and maintenance activities of existing facilities. So now we'll focus on providing an overview of the program priorities established in the proposition, as well as the requirements and preferences proposed by the State Board. So the project priorities established by the proposition include the leveraging of funding sources, providing workforce education and training and job opportunities for disadvantaged communities, and incorporating the Proposition 68, Chapter 11.1 prioritization criteria, which are detailed on the next slide. So these are the detailed prioritization criteria outlined in the guidelines. They consist of the threat posed by groundwater contamination to the affected community's overall drinking water supplies, the potential for groundwater contamination to spread, the potential of the project, if fully implemented, to enhance local water supply reliability, the potential of the project to maximize opportunities to recharge vulnerable high-use groundwater basins, and in situations where the project addresses contamination at a site for which responsible parties have not been identified, or where the identified responsible parties are unwilling and unable to pay for the total cost of cleanup. So in addition to the priorities established by the proposition, the State Board has proposed the following eligibility requirements that all projects must meet. The project must be identified as a high priority by regulatory agencies. The projects must be completed within the appropriation timeframe. Applicants must demonstrate the availability of any matching funds. And applicants must have adequate rights of way for the useful life of the project. The State Board has also proposed the following project preferences. Projects that support and advance the human right to water policy adopted by the State Board. Projects that benefit the largest number of people per dollar spent considering community size. Projects that remove the most contamination at the lowest cost. Projects that promote groundwater sustainability. Applicants that have demonstrated the ability to complete similar projects within scope and on budget, and projects that provide a reduction to an existing public health risk. The State Board will evaluate and score projects or project proposals competitively based upon these program priorities, requirements, and preferences we just covered. So this slide outlines the eligible grant applicants that are outlined in the guidelines. Consist of public agencies, nonprofit organizations, public utilities, federally recognized Indian tribes, as well as California Native American tribes, and mutual water companies. As outlined in the proposition, to be eligible to receive funding for projects must prevent or reduce the contamination of groundwater that serves as a source of drinking water. In addition, projects must meet the eligibility criteria or requirements and project preferences proposed and be consistent with water quality protection. Another eligibility requirement addresses how contamination is defined. We are proposing to define contamination of an aquifer as occurring when a contaminant exceeds a primary MCL or notification level, or when contaminants in combination pose a risk to public health equivalent to exceeding a primary MCL or notification level. Contaminants addressed must result from a discharge of waste. And Appendix A of the draft guidelines includes detailed definitions of both contaminant and contamination. Any questions up to that point? Okay, so now we'll talk about the proposed eligible project types, expenditures, grant amounts, and match requirements. Funding is available for operation and maintenance activities for existing treatment and remediation systems, such as wellhead treatment, groundwater extraction and treatment systems, centralized groundwater treatment systems, and source area cleanup activities. Again, to be eligible, these projects must prevent or reduce contamination of groundwater that serves as a source of drinking water to be considered. So some of the proposed eligible O&M costs for treatment and remediation systems would include permitting, monitoring, reporting on any utility bills, chemicals, replacement or change out of existing equipment, and plant operator expenses. So as part of an application for operations and maintenance activities, funding is also available for small-scale capital improvements. Applicants must be able to demonstrate that the resulting reduction in O&M costs over the useful life of the improvement proposed exceeds the proposed capital cost of that improvement. New infrastructure projects, such as the construction of wellhead treatment facilities, installation of extraction and treatment systems, etc., will be directed to our Proposition 1 groundwater grant program. And Appendix B of the draft guidelines provides an overview of the information necessary to evaluate any capital improvement projects proposed for funding through Proposition 68. So the eligible reimbursement timeframe is based on the passage date of the proposition and the appropriation of the funding. The timeframe for incurring costs eligible for reimbursement will begin no earlier than June 5th, 2018, and end no later than March 31st, 2023. This allows for closeout of all agreements, payment of final invoices before the appropriation end date of June 30th, 2023. The funding agreements for each project will specify the actual eligible start and end dates for reimbursement. So here are some ineligible costs grant program funds cannot be used for. Projects that do not meet the purpose of Proposition 68, Chapter 11.1. Projects not resulting from a discharge of waste. The acquisition of land through eminent domain. Any costs of remediation activities recovered from responsible parties. Any costs incurred outside the terms of the grant agreement. Education and outreach that are not directly related to the project. Equipment costs not integral to the project or included in the budget. Establishment of a reserve fund. Payment of principal or interest of existing debt. Expenses to prepare the proposal. Overhead or costs not directly related to the project, and the payment of state or federal taxes. So this table outlines the proposed limits on grant amounts for eligible projects and is detailed in section 5.1 of the draft funding guidelines. For O&M projects, there is a minimum grant amount of $500,000 per project and a maximum grant amount of $5 million per project with a maximum grant amount of $20 million per applicant. For capital improvements, there is a maximum grant amount of $2 million per project and $5 million per applicant, which would be in addition to any funding received or provided for operations and maintenance activities. A few important things to note. The Deputy Director of the Division may approve funding of projects below the minimum amounts and may increase awards for projects that benefit a SDAC above the maximum grant amounts. If an applicant is applying for multiple projects, the maximum grant limit will be applied on a per project basis up to the maximum set per applicant. So now we'll cover the general match requirements for projects. A minimum local match of at least 50% is required. This can be waived or reduced for projects benefiting a DAC or EDA. Match must consist of eligible reimbursable expenses that were incurred on or after the approval of Proposition 68, which is June 5th of 2018. Match may include federal grants or loans, local and private funding, donated or volunteer services, and in-kind services provided by the applicant, as well as costs recovered by the applicant from responsible parties. So this table outlines the proposed match reduction for projects benefiting DACs and EDAs. We have broken this down into two groups, Group A and Group B. For Group A, an applicant that meets the definition of a DAC or EDA, and where 100% of the project benefits a DAC or EDA, they may qualify for a 0% required match. For Group B, an applicant that does not meet the definition of a DAC or EDA may qualify for a 20% required match for those components of the project that benefit a DAC or EDA. There's a detailed description of the information required to request a match reduction, which can be found in Appendix C of the draft guidelines. So any questions up to that point? Nothing on the email. Okay, so now we will cover the project solicitation and selection process. DFA is proposing to award all funding in a single round. There will be one solicitation. The only exception to this will be for applicants applying for the SDAC set-aside. These will be accepted on a continuous basis until the set-aside has been awarded. These funds still must be encumbered by June 30th of 2021. We'll post a funding solicitation notice that includes further details of the proposal submission deadline, anticipated award dates, and other funding deadlines after adoption of the draft guidelines. So in this slide, we're going to provide an overview of the project selection process. First, a detailed proposal consisting of scope, schedule, and budget would be submitted by applicants in FAST. All proposals will be evaluated for completeness and eligibility by DFA staff and then reviewed by a technical team based on the scoring evaluation criteria included in the draft funding guidelines. Eligible projects solely benefiting a DAC or EDA would be funded first. Remaining projects will be evaluated and ranked by a technical review committee, and only the most competitive projects will be recommended for funding. Based on the results of the scoring evaluation, the Deputy Director will decide whether or not to offer a conditional preliminary award of funding for the project. Division will only enter into a grant agreement once all conditions outlined in the preliminary award letter are met. And once the grant agreement is signed and executed, the project can be implemented. As part of the proposal evaluation and ranking, all projects will be evaluated based upon the following criteria: project and applicant background, the program or project priorities, requirements, and preferences, the scope of work, the schedule, budget, and the performance evaluation and monitoring. The point values have been assigned to indicate the weight of the criteria outlined, and this information is covered in detail in Appendix D of the draft guidelines. So now I'm going to go over a few additional requirements that applicants must address in the funding proposal and prior to the execution of a grant agreement. As part of the funding proposal, all applicants must provide estimates for one or more of the following metrics of success for the proposed project. These metrics would be reported on an annual basis over the funding term of the agreement. And they include the volume of clean drinking water provided or prevented from becoming contaminated, the population or residential connections that directly benefit from the project, the population or percentage of a DAC directly benefiting from the project, the average and total mass of contaminant removed, and the percent reduction of the contaminant. The grant agreements will include the development of a project assessment and evaluation plan, or PAEP, that will be utilized to evaluate the actual project performance relative to these metrics of success. As part of the application process and prior to the execution of a grant agreement, applicants must demonstrate that they have made reasonable efforts to identify any potentially responsible parties. Per the proposition, the State Board is to prioritize projects where the responsible party has not yet been identified or is unwilling or unable to pay for the total cost of cleanup. The courts and or regulatory agencies have the authority to identify responsible parties. Projects will be considered ineligible for funding if responsible parties are willing to pay for the total cost of cleanup associated with the project. And applicants should contact the appropriate regulatory agencies and provide documentation summarizing the status of potentially responsible parties as part of their funding application. So here's a list highlighting the general program requirements, or some of the general program requirements. A full list is detailed in Section 9 of the draft guidelines. Applicants must comply with state and federal confidentiality and conflict of interest laws. Grantees must comply with labor code regarding prevailing wage, and CEQA regarding potential impacts to the environment. There's no funding for any ongoing litigation. Grantees are required to assess and report on the project effectiveness in a Project Assessment and Evaluation Plan, or PAEP. Projects must include a monitoring plan and appropriate data management. Grantees must submit quarterly progress reports detailing all project activities. Grantees must maintain and operate the facilities throughout the useful life of the project. And projects must comply with state water planning and reporting requirements, which are detailed in section 10.12 of the draft guidelines. Any questions up to that point? Okay, so in terms of next steps, again, the funding guidelines were released on May 17th of this year. The comment period ends on July 3rd at noon. You can see the public notice on our website for submission instructions and addresses. The board will consider adoption of the final draft guidelines in August of 2019. And if all goes to plan, the solicitation for proposals will occur this fall, with grant agreements executed as early or hopefully by spring of 2020. To stay informed on any program updates, including the adoption of the draft guidelines and a notification of any proposal solicitation, be sure to sign up for our email subscriptions on our website and selecting the Groundwater Quality Funding Assistance list. You can always send us questions and comments to our general groundwater inbox, or the program webpage will also contain any updates relating to the funding guideline adoption or to the proposal solicitation. And with that, thank you for coming, unless there's any other questions. Yeah.
I have to introduce myself. Hi, thank you. My name is Jennifer Lukens, and I'm with Lukens Brothers Water Company up in South Lake Tahoe. And we have a PCE contamination issue up there, and we're working collaboratively with the other two affected water systems up in Tahoe, South Tahoe PUD, which is a public utility district, and then Tahoe Keys Water Company, which is a homeowners association. So as far as eligibility requirements, if we were to apply for funding through Prop 68, which agency would fill out the application? Because my agency is the disadvantaged community, but we're an investor-owned utility, so we're subject to taxes on grants. Tahoe Keys Water Company is a privately owned homeowners association, not a DAC. And then South Tahoe Public Utility District, they usually don't qualify and have to pay the match. So how could we apply and not have to pay taxes on the grant and be able to qualify as a DAC and make this work?
I think we should probably follow up offline because it's a very specific case, but I think part of what would weigh into it also is like the project that you're applying for, who is operating and maintaining that project. So we probably have to consider that. And then, of course, who's benefiting from what's being operated and try to figure out the best, solution for you guys. But we can figure that out.
And then one follow-up question. Is the Prop 68 funding only for the O&M portion of it, only for projects that have been constructed and are not in process of being constructed, waiting on funding from SRF?
So I guess it will have to weigh when you anticipate that you will start operating, because there's a certain time frame that you can request, O&M funding. And so, if you'll be operating during that time period, then it may be workable, but we'll have to kind of balance how soon you think you'll be complete.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So the question online is, will the project address non-point source contamination like nitrate be eligible? So that's part one. And the second part is, can the funding be used for O&M of existing facilities that addresses nitrate contamination?
In general, if we can demonstrate that it's due to a discharge of a waste, then it could be eligible, but we need to also see in the proposal that there will actually be, a reduction or prevention of contamination. So, this is geared towards projects that will remediate groundwater, and so we would need to see that demonstrated in the proposal.
Anybody else have any other questions? No? Well, thank you for attending online or coming in person. Like I said, if any other questions or comments do come up in the meantime, feel free to reach out via email to our groundwater inbox, and you can check our website for any additional updates or information. Thank you.